Or use it to justify weakness, submission, or inaction. For the noble barbarian, there is no question as to whether violence against people who are not your people is good or evil, or even morally justified. The only important questions about violence are, do I want to use violence? Is initiating violence in this scenario likely to produce a desirable result? Do I have a tactically viable plan for executing this violence? Am I capable of executing this violence effectively to produce the desired result? What are the potential long and short-term risks involved in initiating violence in this scenario? Is the desired result worth those risks? If the answer to all of those questions is yes, then by all means, press play.
What is conservatism? In America, we have a very conventional view of what conservatism is. Conservatism basically consists of small government and some modicum of family values and some type of Christian principle, although we will not subscribe to a specific denomination of Christianity. We want to take some morals and some principles from the Christian religion under the guise of Judeo-Christian culture. This is, for the most part, how we as Americans see conservatism. But what truly is conservatism? Conservatism simply means to conserve a set of principles and a culture. That is what conservatism is. Shinzo Abe, the Prime Minister of Japan, is a conservative because he wants to conserve ancient Japanese religion, he wants to conserve Japanese culture, and he also wants to bring back emperor worship, which is a part of the Japanese history and a part of their culture, really. It's just that, you know, that part of their culture has been sort of ignored by a lot of people, but there are enough people in Japan who want to revive all of that. So in that particular movement of Japanese nationalism, you find a form of conservatism. The neo-Ottomanist in Turkey, they are conservatives because they want to preserve the culture of the Sultanate in Turkey. They want to bring back that old history. They want to revive some idea of the glory days of their history. They are conservatives. In America, we have the conventional view of what a conservative is, but at the same time, they are different strands of conservative. They are different strands. And those different strands, those differences are determined by which part of history you want to revive, which part of history you want to romanticize and glorify. That determines what type of conservative you are. You have the 1950s conservative, the type of conservative who glorifies and romanticizes the 1950s. Oh, it was the peak of the American empire. You know, they had the nuclear family, they had Christian values, divorce was so rare. That's the time that I want to go back, even though there's a lot of misconceptions about the 1950s. There was plenty of suffering that went on. There was plenty of weirdities that took place. There was plenty of dysfunctional behavior in the 1950s, but I'm just giving an example as to one strand of conservatism that is determined by a perception of a part of American history. You have some conservatives who want to go back to the Reagan era, which means they want to go back to the 1980s. And they talk about, oh, Reagan, he was this amazing president and America was so great in those days. And so they want to go back to that time. And then you have conservatives who want to go back to the Civil War era, and they want to bring back Jim Crow laws and all that stuff. And you have that type of conservative. The most common type of conservative in America is the Reagan conservative. They want to go back to the Reagan era. But that is quickly changing. We are going into a really bizarre strand of conservatism. This is the type of person who wants to go back to, they want to go back to the 1930s. They want to go back to Nazism. They want to go back to the racism that was very, very popular, was very common in the first half of the 20th century. They want to go back to those days. You have a lot of people like that, and they'll show videos from the Third Reich, and they'll say, look, a world without migrants and brown people and minorities. Look, people are wearing suits, and they look really clean. Look how amazing it is. And they show some black and white video, and they show some woman in a dress, and oh, she's so beautiful. Look, the women were women in those days. And they are romanticizing an era that they never lived through, and an era that they have really little knowledge about. Because the fact that they're when you find someone who is glorifying an era, they tend not to have that much knowledge about it. Because if you really read the details of a particular era of human history, you'll read about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And you'll realize, hey, they had good things in those days, and they had some pretty bad things in those days, just like today. Today we have some really good things, like the fact that 29% of all vegetable gardens in the US are raised by my generation. That's a good thing. Makes me proud to be a millennial. Truly, I'm not being facetious here. But there are some really, really horrendous things in our own time, and I know that you guys know about all those horrendous things, so I don't have to list them out for you. So when you find people glorifying a certain era, it means that they have very little knowledge about it, or they're simply liars and instigators, and they are bad faith agents. But then you have another type of conservative. This is an even more weird and strange strand of conservatism. And these are the people who want to go back to pre-Christian paganism. They want to conserve the ancient culture of their people. And that consists of worshiping the sun and the moon, making cakes from chicken blood maybe, and maybe even killing a baby as a human sacrifice to their gods. They want to go back to those times. And they will glorify, some of them will glorify the pagan Roman Empire, and they'll say, look, that was an era when men were men, and they'll read, they'll read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, which is actually a really, really good book, a lot of wisdom in it, even though it is pagan. There's a lot of wisdom in it, and it is an enjoyable read. But they'll read these types of books with a very sick and sinister and morphed mentality, because they'll read it with some idea of returning back to paganism and returning back to some despotic Caesar worship. And they'll say, look, people fought in the gladiatorial games. That those were the days when men were men and they were masculine. And look, I read this book here. It comes from this series of bios of the Roman Caesars, and it talks about how the Caesars glorified the virtue of a good woman, and see, those were the days. There was morality in those times. And then they'll glorify human sacrifice and gladiatorial worship. Well, it was a worship service. Gladiatorial games technically were a human sacrifice, but they'll glorify the gladiatorial games and then they'll say, we have to return to the glory days of masculinism and all that stuff. Masculinity. And there is a lot of this that's taking place. And they get into a neo-pagan folk music, and a lot of neo-pagan folk music comes from Europe. There is some things that come from the United States, but for the most part, it comes from Europe. It comes from Scandinavia, comes from Germany. It comes even from Eastern Europe. In fact, a lot of this stuff comes from Eastern Europe, specifically Ukraine. and Belarus. There's a lot of this stuff happening, a lot of neo-paganism. And this is a very destructive strand of conservatism. Not all of conservatism is bad. Conservatism is simply a term that describes a way of thinking. You want to conserve something. And really, we are all conservative. To a certain extent, we are all liberal, Republican, we are all conservative because we all want to conserve a certain set of principles. And if you go by the strand of conservatism that wants to conserve the pagan culture of the past, then you're going to really pave the way to Nazism, because then you're going to have to get into paganism. Paganism is the native religion of your country. That means you're going to reject Christianity as a foreign religion. And if you're really hardcore, you'll start calling Christianity a Jewish or Semitic religion. Therefore, it's foreign and shouldn't be here. Even though Christianity is a global religion, it is a universal religion, which is why the Catholic Church literally means the universal church. But nonetheless, you are going to start hating foreigners because they're not native to your land and they're not native to your history. And so neo-paganism is the doorway to Nazism. And if you have an era where neo-paganism becomes the norm, then what you end up with is an ideology that both the left and the right would agree with. Because the left loves paganism, the right also is going back to paganism. Because you have people who consider themselves Christians who are, who call themselves right-wing, but there is a huge part of the right-wing movement that is pagan, and you will find collaboration between so-called Christians and these neo-pagans in the name of fighting mass immigration. And you see a lot of this going on in Europe. And so from very naive and stupid LARPing, going to neo-pagan folk festivals and dressing up like you're a druid, that escalates into something very, very dangerous. G.K. Chesterton actually talks about this. He talks about the danger of fantasizing. And he says, in the pagan world of fantasy, you have the sun and the moon that are husband and wife. And you have, some deity flying his chariot across the Milky Way. And after so long of merely fantasizing and LARPing, you want to see your religion manifest into reality. And how do you do that? Well, you do it by doing a human sacrifice. And the human sacrifice, the bloodletting ritual, is a way to get your religion to incarnate itself into reality. It's not just the sun and the moon as, abstract deities. It's the sun and the moon are real, and we are going to express our belief in the realness of these deities by shedding human blood. And so fantasizing, when enough people believe in the fantasy, becomes extremely dangerous. We saw this with the French Revolution, where you had, at first, a small amount of people believing that the idea of the absence of government or the absence of monarchy, the idea that we should have a government in which literally the only rulers are the people. From a small group of people believing in that, you had enough people to the point where you had utter horrific bloodshed in the streets of France, and you had the Reign of Terror. But really, the neo-pagan stuff is a form of conservatism because it is trying to conserve a set of values and principles that stems from a glorification of history. And the question that I have for conservatives is, when does it end? When does your view of conserving a set of principles and culture end? Does it end with the 1950s? Does it end with the 1980s? Does it end with the 20th century? Or, do you want to go back further than that and go to BC times? When does it end? Who's to say that there is an end? Who's to say that there isn't a limit? And this is my problem with conservatism. This is my problem with all of that stuff, because there is this weird glorification of the past that gets so obsessive that it turns out to outright dangerous LARPing. And if you look at, shooters like Andres Breivik, these guys were LARPers. They LARPed about the Middle Ages. And the LARPing got so bad that they wanted that fantasy to become a reality, and Anders Breivik slaughtered a bunch of kids thinking that he was some Templar knight. It's very, very dangerous stuff. But conservatism is about preserving a certain culture that stems from history. And the question that I have is, how far do you want to go back? When does it end? What's the limit? Anyway, hope you guys have enjoyed this message. Hope you guys have learned something from this message. You guys just heard some theology. God bless.